So yesterday I did a LinkedIn post, which is my usual approach of making a kind of general statement, missing a lot of the nuance about a topic that I wanted to talk about, which in this case was burn down charts and the mistake that a lot of teams make in focusing on outputs and the graphs that represent those outputs, which often distract us from actually focusing on our goals. And my friend James commented, making the point that there are examples of graphs that are very useful to teams, things like CT scatter plots and cumulative flow diagrams that often can help us have better discussions and make better decisions. And this is the exact sort of comment I love. This is someone who thinks as deeply about this as me, kind of diving into some of the nuance that I've left out of my post. And the bit that I thought was worth expanding upon in the video was what I see as the difference between output graphs and other kinds of graphs and data that can be very, very useful for teams in general, including obviously for Scrum teams. And so the reason this post obviously came about was because I was thinking particularly about burn down charts, which I see as output graphs. And the reason I would describe it as that is it only really shows one thing, and that's your output as a team, right? How many story points or sometimes how many user stories does the team deliver or mark done on a given day of the sprint? And so this is only one thing, output, which is not really the thing that we want teams to focus on, which I might come back to a bit later. But the other big mistake that burn down charts make, in my view, or the way they can mislead us, is because they've got this ideal versus actual that you can see here, which really sort of locks us into this worldview that once we've planned in our sprint and decided on a number of user stories that we're going to deliver, that then our ideal state is to deliver those user stories. And what often happens is teams get to this point in the sprint where they can see that we're behind our forecast, and okay, well, now what are we going to do about that? We're going to work extra hard or cut some corners or change some things to make sure that those work items get to done. And the problem with this is, again, this is output, this is number of user stories. And for a Scrum team, hopefully we're focusing on a sprint goal, but even for other kinds of teams, we should be focusing on an outcome that has value to our customers, which is often not actually related to the number of work items that we deliver. And in fact, if that outcome is heavily related to delivering all of those individual user stories that we've planned, that's probably a good sign that we've actually made some very tightly coupled and not very vertically sliced, not very valuable independent work items, which tells us that we might have a problem with our refinement or design practices. But getting away from that, again, the point I'm just trying to make here is that by looking at a burn down chart and focusing on the outputs, our lizard brains tend to drive us towards, therefore, trying to keep those outputs in line with the plan or to increase them over time, focusing on getting a certain number of things done. And that output focus, in my view, is a mistake. And when we compare that to something like a cumulative flow diagram, this is a diagram that I use a lot. It's a graph that I really, really think most teams should be looking at a lot. And at a glance, you could be mistaken for thinking that these are very, very similar, right? We're still looking at some time bounded changes over time in work items being delivered. But there are a couple of really important distinctions here that, for me, make this something different than just an output graph. So, in particular, right, what we're seeing here is multivariate. We're not just looking at one thing, the number of work items delivered, although you can get that from this graph. What we're particularly looking at is how the work items change over time through our different workflow states, which, yeah, it does allow us to kind of try to push for getting more things done. But it'll also quickly reveal, for example, if we start seeing a big divergence in the number of items in coding versus testing, well, we might have a bottleneck in our testing practice, right? And that's a problem that we might want to solve. Similarly, if the number of work items not started is increasing significantly more rapidly than the number of work items getting into the complete state, again, this gives us an area of focus. It gives us a conversation that we can have that isn't necessarily just focused on trying to get things done. And in particular, what this doesn't have is some ideal state, some trend line that we're trying to stick to that forces us to focus on those outputs. Instead, if we're having a conversation about our goals, our value outcomes, the increment or product that we're trying to deliver for our customers, this graph doesn't prevent us from doing less, or it doesn't discourage us from not doing as much work if it's the right thing to do. And again, the reason this matters is because, in my experience, the amount of work that a team does is rarely correlated with how valuable that team is or how much value it delivers. In fact, there's often a reverse correlation. So the teams that I see that deliver the most value and most consistently deliver their planned goals or most consistently achieve their goals are actually teams that focus on significantly less. The teams that focus on one or two really impactful things and then constantly reassess and readjust their plan. And again, this matters because a lot of people don't necessarily believe this, don't understand it. And certainly, I've seen people, even confronted with the data, still not really want to accept the reality that doing less is doing more. But in the real world, it turns out, certainly in complex ways of working, that most of the work that we do is not actually valuable. It doesn't have the outcome that we intend. And this is sort of like a Pareto principle, which is to say 80% of the value that we deliver comes from 20% of the work that we do, which, if you follow that to its natural conclusion, means that 80% of the work that we're doing probably shouldn't really be our focus and shouldn't be being done. But if we are focusing on a burn down chart and we're focusing on trying to keep to our blue trend line, we'll keep relentlessly trying to spend time and energy on that 80% of less valuable work instead of maybe pivoting or stepping back and focusing on delivering that 20% that is very, very valuable when that's the right thing to do. And again, just to give a few more examples of this, so another graph that I really like, you can see here, is our cycle time histogram, which, again, you could be forgiven for thinking maybe shows us something very similar, because what we're looking at here is how many of our work items are done in a given time frame. So, for example, you can see here the majority of our work items, or the largest portion of our work items, are done in about 1 day. And then next to that, we've got work items that take 2 days, and that kind of slowly tapers off. But we've got some outliers that take 15, 16, maybe more than 20 days. So again, while this does show us potentially work items delivered, it's not forcing us to focus on just trying to deliver more. Instead, it focuses in on, well, what are our outliers? Which things are maybe taking significantly longer than our average or our median? And what might we do about that? So again, this isn't necessarily an output graph. This is a time taken graph, which is much, much more useful, which again can be easily confused with something like a burn up graph, or you can see a sort of a version of that here, where we're looking at our number of user stories completed over time, which it might seem like a good thing, but we're still just looking at output. And yes, you can get some useful conversation from this. I mean, this is a really interesting one because it shows that our team is actually moving work items to done, and then actually they're going backwards at several points throughout the sprint. Work items that are being marked as done, well, actually they're no longer done, and that's causing a drop in our output. And that's one place where maybe a conversation about output might be useful. But the point here is that's not necessarily the right thing. And our lizard brain is still potentially going to get tricked into trying to make this graph go upwards in a steady or exponential way, which is probably not going to be the thing to focus on if we're trying to get value and outcomes to our customers. Because, in fact, sometimes moving something out of our sprint and saying, actually, no, this isn't the right thing, once we've built it, once we've shown it to someone, maybe we want to drop this and focus on something else. That could be the right thing for us to do. And instead, this graph potentially, by focusing us just on the output, misleads us or misdirects us from that important conversation. So again, I'm not trying to imply here that all graphs are good or bad or anything like that. I'm just trying to demonstrate these different kinds of graphs have different focuses. And so something like a cycle time scatter plot that shows us how over time our work items are starting to take longer than they were in the past, that potentially gives us some useful information, but doesn't just focus us on outputs. Whereas if we're just looking at an actual versus predicted timeline of stories being closed, the only thing that really leads us towards generally is going to be output, which is not what our teams should be focusing on. So again, I really don't want to try and apply that therefore there is no value in a burn down chart and you should never use one. If you're finding value from it, that's great. I personally have never really seen a team long term use burn down charts in a way that is particularly useful, and I often prefer to migrate them or to help them, coach them towards at least experimenting with things like cumulative flows or cycle time histograms, which give us a more time-based and potentially value and context-bound conversation. But if you're getting value from a burn down, that's great. Just because me or someone else says otherwise, that doesn't mean that you have to do what we say, right? But I would encourage you to think about what I've said. I would encourage you to think about whether that burn down chart is causing you to focus on outputs and whether there's maybe a different way to have that conversation. But otherwise, as always, please feel free to let me know in the comments if you think differently, if you've had a different experience, and of course to reach out if you would like any help. Thanks and good luck.